Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Tim He, founder and CEO of Cherry Tree. Given his experience advising founders along with leading others, I'm excited to have him share his insights with you. Well, welcome, Tim. Can you please share with us a story that has shaped the trajectory of your career and where you are today? Whether it's oh shit, I would never do that again, or you know what? That was actually one of the most valuable things that I could probably redo again.
Sure. Okay. So I can swear on this podcast, I just found out. So that's going to be amazing. All right. I say that because the story I want to share is actually teaching at a university. Sometimes, especially in the beginning, I wasn't sure what I could say, how much I should filter, especially depending on if there were other faculty or, administration in the room. I have a lot of funny stories about that, but I'll save that for another time. But I guess the story I wanted to share is like how I got into coaching co-founders in the first place. And wow, 6 years ago, I started a company and I kind of did like everything that people told me to do and everything people told me not to do. So, people were like, don't start a business with your friends. Well, like I started a business with my best friend. And they're like, don't start business with strangers. I did that too. And so I did a little bit of everything and just had a lot of highs and lows as a co-founder. And at the same time, I was teaching entrepreneurship in Seattle. And a lot of my students would ask me the same questions every quarter. Like, I don't know, how do I find a co-founder? How do we split equity? What do you do if we fight? Can they fire me? Can I fire them? And a lot of the stuff that they were asking was stuff that I was going through like real time with my co-founders because I had just started the company and I was teaching at the same time. And so we were all kind of figuring it out together. And I think that was really interesting because a lot of the other professors were like, very experienced, sold multiple companies in their 40s and 50s. And they're kind of like prescribing stuff to do. Whereas at the time, I was actually a little bit insecure because I didn't have the answer for the students. And I was kind of figuring it out. But over time, the students would come back to me, like years later and tell me that the stuff that I was sharing with them actually helped more than what some of the other professors had shared with them, because what the other professors did, might have worked for their company, 10, 15 years ago, but it wasn't like a reality today. And so that kind of got me interested in like helping more people along the way. And so that's also why I started Cherry Tree, which is sharing like all sorts of co-founder insights as I go, not necessarily, 10 years after an exit or something like that. And so a lot of these like little steps and missteps along the way got me really into co-founder coaching.
You know that I really appreciate about your story is when you talked about, hey, I'm sharing these experiences in real time, because I think along the way with information and everything changing at such a rapid pace, people appreciate having that insight, but also being able to contextually translate that into their situation. Because like you said, it's like someone else might not have succeeded building a business with their friend, but maybe you'll be different. And then until you experience it, you're not going to know, and you're not going to know why. So I'm curious for you, when you battled through some of that internal dialogue where you're like, oh, that experienced professor with like 50,000 years worth of experience probably could teach this in such a different way than I can. So I kind of feel like, how much value can I have? How did you work through that internal monologue and overcome that?
Yeah, that was a very long process. I think I taught over 1,000 students over 30 courses or 32 courses or something like that. And so I don't think that ever left until I stopped teaching, actually, because, we're constantly talking with other faculty and other students and seeing how other people do it, right? So you always have an idea of what the department is doing. And sometimes I'd sit in on somebody else's lecture and like, wow, like I wish I could do that. And then somebody would sit down on my lecture and they would point out things that they like that I didn't even do intentionally, that just came across because of how I like to lecture. And so that was really interesting. But I think what I had as an advantage was I was also in school at the time. And so my students, like some of them are older than me and some of them we were the same age and whatnot. And so it was really like we were peers, not like a student like talking to a professor. And so they would come to me with stuff that I don't think they would normally go to a different professor about, things in their personal life, in their dating lives, and like social stuff. I hang out with them after class. And so it was kind of like we were just friends and I was helping them with something that I knew a little bit about. And so we had a lot of fun at office hours. Fridays, this was during COVID, so we had a lot of this over Zoom, but every other Friday I would do 1 p.m. to 1 a.m. office hours. And students would just come in and go, we'd chat. We'd go get dinner or have dinner separately at home. And it was just a lot of fun. And I think no other faculty member that I know of could have replicated that because they didn't have the same relationship with the students. Like my girlfriend was group mates with one of the students in a different class. And so, we were all kind of working together. I was in classes with some of them in a different class as well. And then I was their lecturer in another class. So it just felt like a bunch of friends. And that actually helped me get over a lot of the insecurities because when you're just talking to your friend, like there's no pressure, right? And that actually helped me teach better and get my points across even better. So over time, I kind of just got comfortable with it.
Curious how you translated that into coaching other founders as you continue to be a leader, because sometimes I realize is that sometimes when you are one of the youngest individuals in the room and you come from an ethnic background where you're really taught to respect the elders and not really step out of your box that you were given. I'm curious as to how you were able to, again, translate some of the things that you learned in the classroom and as you navigate your journey in coaching leaders as well.
Yeah, no, I like that you bring that up because I just came back from Korea and there's a huge culture of really respecting the elderly. But I think in some cases, and not all, but like the elderly kind of take it to an extreme. And it can be uncomfortable. It can be, some people call it, the what's deserved or whatever it is, right? But to your point, the idea of not just respecting your elders, but in an organization, you might defer to somebody more senior because they should know what they're talking about, right? And that should be the case. And so when I first started teaching, I was teaching with another professor who was much older, and we were really good friends. And so I think he was in his 50s or 60s at that point, but he would defer to me as if we were peers, and we were obviously not. He'd been teaching for longer than I'd been alive, so he knew what he was doing. But a lot of times he just asked for my opinion, and I always say that he was the only guy who ever had, I guess, the right to really treat me like a subordinate. I was literally his assistant, but he treated me like a friend. And so I think when you have that sort of mentor-mentee relationship, it's a lot easier to come across and just do stuff and take risks, within reason that you normally wouldn't in an environment you're not comfortable with. And then when I got different jobs with other managers and then eventually reports of my own, I kind of wanted to mimic that. And so I don't know, I don't have a perfect answer for this, but sometimes you just have to speak your mind. Maybe you're wrong because you don't have the experience, but I actually never really found that to be the case. In the cases that I was wrong, it wasn't that I didn't have the experience. It was more that I didn't have the context. And I guess the higher up the ladder you go, the more context you have. But the number of years of experience really doesn't have too much to do with it, because in your organization, somebody who's been there for 5 years might not even have worked as much as you if you've been there for 5 months, or the other way around, or whatever it is. So just looking at that number is not too important. I think context matters a lot more.
Really great call out on that context piece. And I'm curious, as you've progressed through your leadership journey, what has been one of the biggest leadership epiphanies you've had to date?
Ooh, one of the biggest. There's been a lot. Let's see. Okay, here's a tough one that I think is kind of unique to my experience. So one of the companies I started with my friend. We were all really close. We hung out outside of the company, but we also, worked a lot together. And then eventually the company got to a point where we were hiring people that were strangers, people who applied to our job posting. But then they'd become friends with us really quickly too, because we really focused on hiring for good fit. And so that was a lot of fun, right? Until I had to fire one of them. And it was weird because we were still really good friends, nothing against them personally. And so it was difficult because we both knew it was the right decision. They had other commitments and priorities that were, mattered a little bit more than working on the company. And we just couldn't have that. And so I talked to my co-founders about it because we're all, really good friends. And my co-founder sort of assured me that they would understand if I had to let them go. But that doesn't make it easier, right? And so I talked to the person, and that was really hard because after I fired them, we didn't talk for a couple of weeks. And normally we would all hang out and play poker or do whatever. And they didn't come to these social gatherings anymore outside of the company. So that kind of hurt a little bit because I felt like I lost a friend more than a employee. And so that's half the story. So I never wanted to fire anybody again. I knew that was inevitable, but I just never wanted to go through that again. And then not soon after, one of my co-founders actually said that they wanted to leave. So I wasn't firing them. They just had to leave because they were working a separate job. They were going off to law school. And yeah, so that was another tough conversation because that was the same co-founder that reassured me that, they would understand, that the person I fired would understand. And so it was kind of the opposite side of that. And, we hugged it out, we cried it out. Obviously, I couldn't keep her. She had priorities. And I think reflecting on the two of those together made me realize that if somebody wants to go, I should not try to convince them to stay, which sounds kind of weird because I really tried to get her to stay. I told her we can make it work. We can reduce your hours. We can make you an advisor. We can do whatever, right? Yeah, I can pay you like whatever it takes. But I realized that that only hurts both parties because if you convince them to stay and it works, then they'll resent you for taking you away from what they were going to go. In my case, my co-founder went to law school. If it doesn't work, now you're both just sad. But if you don't try to convince them, they'll understand that, you want to work with them, but they have to do what's best for themselves. And you understand that they're not taking this lightly. And it's a decision that, they really thought over and had to go. And at the same time, the flip side is also true where if somebody, has to leave the organization because they're not a fit anymore, I shouldn't try to convince myself that they should stay because no hard feelings, like the company changes or circumstances changes. It's not personal. And actually, the faster you do it, the better for both parties. Which I think that part is a sort of standard advice, but the first part about not convincing the co-founders to stay was a tough lesson to learn. But marrying the two together is sort of how I see personal changes now.
It takes a lot of self-awareness and putting other people first in your company first to understand that concept because what can go really wrong really quickly, especially when you're in a startup and you're moving really fast and depending on how much funding you have, if you don't fire fast, when it's not a fit, that one decision to not fire fast can actually cripple your company, depending again on the circumstance, context, etc. And it ties into our theme of today, which is just your bread and butter is co-founder conflict. What are 3 potential red flags that could sink your startup? And the first one that I wanted to dive into is the importance of having a shared sense of humor because business can be serious. So how do we intertwine sense of humor and what have you noticed in this realm?
Yeah, that's actually one of the most frequently asked questions I get. Like, how do I find a good co-founder? And if you look on Reddit or Medium or Quora, that's like, there's like 1,000 articles on how to find a good co-founder. And all of them cover things like compatibility, like you have to have complementary skills, which is sure, great. Things like circumstances, like you can both devote your time to the company and, preferably you're in the same city or at least time zone. Great. Things like you have enough domain expertise or experience to actually like build something. Great. And I think that advice gets repeated so much that when people hear it, you kind of just like nod along and take it as gospel. Like you don't really think about it. But if you put that same advice in the context of marriage, like a romantic relationship, it doesn't work. Right? Let's say you have complementary skills. Sure. Whatever that means. You're in the same city. Well, I'd hope so. Or at least the same times. I'd hope so. And that you have similar interests and experience. Sure. Like maybe you both like sushi. And when you put those things, when you check those 3 boxes, it doesn't make the case for a particularly strong relationship in a marriage. So why would it make a strong case for a co-foundership when a lot of people compare co-founderships to marriages and you actually probably spend more time with your co-founder in some periods of time than with your spouse? And so I started thinking about that. And it really comes down to a shared sense of humor, or at least the same definition of happiness and having fun, right? Because if you can't laugh with them, like the absurdity of entrepreneurship is just so insane. Like you can't really describe it. If you've been an entrepreneur, you are one, like you know what it means, right? And so even if you have all sorts of compatibility on paper, but you can't share a laugh together, you can't go to dinner and have fun together, like then what's the point, right? You're never going to survive. And so I think that's something I got lucky with because I started one of my first companies with my friends. So, naturally we had a lot of fun working together. There were times when we stayed up till 5 a.m, having conversations, not even about the company or going on long walks or, trips or whatever it is. And I think that if we didn't have that, then we would just be any, regular coworkers or colleagues. And that's not going to work as a co-founder.
So many golden nuggets in there. And it makes me think back to just when it comes to marriage in itself, like a lot of times what ends up happening is that when finances are not the same, right? Sometimes work ethic, you outgrow one another. And then when you talk about that sense of humor, where if someone's constantly like, you're so immature, I can't even get on the same page, right? There's a lot of those different nuances that I don't think we think about that plays such a huge role. And I'm curious for you because I've heard of the term finding your co-founder is like dating. It takes time, and you quickly learn what does and does not work. So for you, have you developed like a North Star where you're like, okay, I know myself this way. This is generally what I need to look for in others. And do you provide other co-founders with that same thing? Hey, these are some of the North Stars that you want to make, like maybe think about as you decide whether or not you need a co-founder.
Whether you need a co-founder is a tough question to ask, because it's like asking whether you need a spouse. Right? It's like nobody needs one, right? You can survive, you can function without one, but there are a lot of benefits, like reducing the workload, more domain expertise, more connections, whatever. Again, it comes back to like that fit. Having the wrong co-founder is worse than having no co-founder. The same way having the wrong spouse is worse than just not having a spouse, right? And so you need the right one is a better way of thinking about it than you just need one. Because for a lot of the work, you can hire contractors or just do it yourself, or whatever it is, hire an intern if you or whatever, right? A lot of it comes down to the emotional investment in the company, the same way in a marriage, it's the emotional investment in the relationship. And so some VCs actually require a co-founder, but that gets really nuanced and specific as to like workload and stuff like that. So we'll put that aside for a little bit. But if the workload is too much, your first assumption should not be to get a co-founder. I think it's if the emotional journey is better managed with a co-founder and you have somebody who you like working with already, and they can provide other things to the table that you cannot in the form of skills or connections or insights, then having that co-founder might be a good idea. So it's a nuanced question.
I appreciate that there can be a lot of nuances. And now I'm going to switch gears into the FAQs aspect. I know you had alluded earlier that a lot of individuals will ask you, can you fire your co-founder? So what does that actually look like?
Yeah, funny story. So a co-founder, I'm going to try really hard not to dox them and not to say any names or anything, but a co-founder reached out to me, said that they were having trouble with their co-founder. They had just raised a seed round. So they had, 7 figures in funding, and things are ramping up. They were hiring really quickly and developing their product really quickly. But the co-founder who reached out to me, let's call them like co-founder A. They said that co-founder B actually asked them to step down from a co-founder role and take an advisory role. And so that's like wait, why? Like we're just picking up traction. Why would I step down now? And so they talked to their lawyers and investors and mentors, and nobody could give a concrete answer because they had a really weird and wacky equity and board structure. Board couldn't come to an agreement, and it just took a really long time. So they were stalling a lot of product development. And so they came to me, and over the course of a couple of weeks, actually, I think it might have been like 2 months, we worked through why co-founder B asked co-founder A to step down. They had been friends previously. They went to college together, they traveled the world together, even lived together. And so they were really close. And to be blindsided like that, not only hurt the co-foundership, but it really hurt their friendship. For co-founder A, it felt like co-founder B wanted to fire them, but couldn't. So they tried to reduce them in their roles and responsibilities. And so after a lot of back and forth and stalemates, and then people trying to focus on the product and the marketing component and pushing off the co-foundership, it got to a point where it just wasn't sustainable because they were taking the company in different directions. Their reports were confused of who to talk to, who they couldn't talk to. And it's like when the parents fight and the kids are confused, and that was exactly what it seemed like. And so it got to a point where we had to involve an attorney to figure out what could be done legally. And without getting into the legal details, it was the right decision for co-founder A to actually fire co-founder B, right? And that's like a reverse, because co-founder B was the one who wanted to fire co-founder A. And so I don't think I can share much more than that. But when it comes to firing a co-founder, there's a couple things. First is all the legal stuff, the equity, the vesting, and all that. Get that taken care of by a professional. It just saves a lot of headache, because when they reached out to me, they were kind of fuzzy on who they were talking to, who they were trying to get advice from. but I told them to just like get an answer in writing so you know exactly what you can and can't do, and you know, protect everybody. So deal with that first. The second thing is like understand that some doors you cannot come back in from. You know, when you leave the airport and they're like, once you exit out of here, you can't go back in. Like firing a co-founder is definitely one of those doors. And just know that it's going to have repercussions for both the company and your friendship. For these two co-founders, all of the conversation between them was about the company, which makes sense, right? Like you dedicated so much of your time and energy to this. They have outside capital, millions of dollars. They have users. Like it's a huge responsibility. But they were still living together, right? So imagine like firing your co-founder and then waking up the next day and seeing them in the kitchen. It's like, how do you deal with that, right? They ended up moving out. Co-founder B moved in with their partner actually in a different city. So they left that living situation. And so in theory, this kind of looks like a good example, right? Like you made the right decision for the company as far as we can tell. Nothing blew up legally or with the investors, and product development continued to go, right? And so you think that's a good thing. And maybe it is, depending on which angle you're looking at it from. But they both lost a friend, right? And they both lost a really good friend, somebody that they spent many, many hours together. And so I think that's a thing that people don't really think about. And I think the moral of the story is like the firing stuff is like a procedure. You check your boxes, you do the legal, the money, the, you know, whatever. But don't forget to check that friendship box. Or even if you're just, you know, coworkers with a great professional working relationship, I think that's very important. And I think that's where, again, I got lucky with a lot of my co-founders. But to your point of like firing a co-founder or being fired, you have to understand that even if it is personal, where personal disagreements get in the way, doing it for the business is what matters, but not at the expense of destroying your friendship. Now, if they were thinking, hey, we're friends, let's both stay in the company and not fire each other because we're friends and it'll be awkward, but the company went to shit, well, you kind of have to, you know, pick and choose, right? And so that's all to say there's no cookie cutter solution. I can't tell somebody to do something when just because it's worked for this particular company. And maybe, who knows, maybe in 2 years they're going to go bankrupt. Hopefully not. But, you know, who knows, right?
Hey, you know what? I actually want to dive into that legality piece from the perspective of, you know, when you're first friends, or let's just say you're first dating a partner and you're like, why would I want a prenup? Like, it feels like it's not fair to put that on my partner because it shows that I'm not trusting of them. But then I think what a lot of individuals don't understand, that the prenup isn't for the good days. It's for the days where there's a lot of emotions attached, and then it goes sideways and you have this thing to say, hey, legally, to cover you and to cover me, this is how it could look like. So from a co-founder relationship perspective, are there certain documents, especially if you're going to go into business with a friend, that you would recommend being like, hey, maybe consider having this in place and having it in writing so that if it goes awry, you're covered?
Yeah, I have a fun story for that one. I was working with not a co-founder. He was a solo founder of a small coffee company. And he was a Navy SEAL veteran. They brought me and a couple other people on to do growth. So not even for co-founder stuff. I also have a background in strategy and growth, and that was what we were hired to do. And another guy that they brought in was also a veteran. And I think they had worked together overseas. And so you think about relationships like that, right? It's like they've been to war together, literally to war. And you think like packaging coffee would pale in comparison, right? And there's co-founders who are married or their family or they grew up together. So you think that they have such a strong relationship that whatever the business is like, it's like no big deal, right? And that's exactly what these two guys thought. They're like, dude, we've jumped out of helicopters together, like putting a shipping label on a thing and shipping it off, no big deal. And I was like, well, I'd be careful about that because they operated on a handshake deal because they trusted each other with their lives, literally. Like you cannot get more close than trusting somebody with your life in the battlefield. Right. And they saw it exactly as that. It was like, why would we need an agreement like this if we trust each other? Like we wouldn't fuck each other over. Why would we need something like this? And I was like, well, no, not if not even if like you're trying to fuck over each other. It's like, what if one of you gets hit by a bus? Like, you know, that's not even up to you. What if this guy's wife gets pregnant and they have to, you know, take some time off work? Like that's not his fault. You're not trying to, you know, actively go against each other, but it's still stuff that needs to be taken care of. And so when you put it like that, that's sort of like the foot in the door. They're like, okay, maybe we'll consider like external circumstances outside of our control. And then that's where you lead them into a little bit of like, okay, well, there actually are a lot of circumstances that we cannot control, and there are a lot that we can't control. And so we agree that we trust each other and we're not going to screw each other over. We're not going to, Mark Zuckerberg each other with equity or whatever it is. And it's like, great, you both agree. So sign on the dotted line and show that you agree on that. Right? And then, so I think people have this like huge reactions to like, I'm not going to screw them over. They're not going to screw me over. And a handshake deal is our way of showing that we trust each other. But when you ease them in with stuff that is outside of their control, it opens them up and at least gets the conversation started. Sometimes they'll push back a little bit more and being like, if that happens, then like that's up to the universe or whatever. So we don't need to do anything about that. So sometimes, yeah, you get a little bit of pushback, but I think the most important thing for co-founders to understand is if they are really reluctant and hesitant to like look at the details in a founder's agreement or co-founders agreement, that can be a red flag in itself. It's like, why don't you want to have this conversation at least? At the end of the conversation, you can both agree and decide that you don't need something like this, which, I don't recommend, but that might be the decision that you both come to. But at least have the conversation, right? And I think that's what a lot of co-founders miss, not just with the founders agreement, but with, decisions later on. It's like they either think they're going to agree or disagree and agree on either of those. And so they assume that they don't have the conversation and that they don't need it. A lot of co-founders that are married or, have been working together for a long time actually fall into this trap because they assume that they know each other so well. Like imagine being a co-founder with your spouse, like them, or with your brother or whatever, right? You grew up together. And so you assume that you don't need explicit communication. But that's actually, definitely not the right way to go. You still want to have these conversations. And best case, like you have the conversation, you're on the same page, great, move on. And so a lot of people don't want to put in that work, maybe because there's a slight risk of them disagreeing and they can't possibly imagine a world in which, they're butting heads. But I'd say it's better to butt heads in that conversation early on than to, destroy the company, because with the coffee company, they don't work together anymore. And so I think that says enough about what they could have done in the beginning.
And you know what? Like it really highlights how it's so much easier to navigate the emotions of those different situations where you're not actually emotionally heated, right? So to be able to be proactive that way is so critical. And again, like you said, it's not about like necessarily fucking each other over. It's just what about the unplanned stuff? And I'm curious for you, like as you continue to help different co-founders and you've navigated a few relationships yourself, are there any crucial conversations that you're now like, okay, like these are maybe 1 to 3 that I want to have upfront just to be proactive?
I'll tell you a framework for actually approaching those conversations, because they're kind of different for different people, right? Depending on your stage of life and whatnot. I don't know if you've seen this, but there's this YouTube video of this, like, I think he's Russian or an American who went to Russia or whatever. Is this comedian, this stand-up comedian. He tells the story of the time he, like, I don't remember exactly, but he robbed a train with the Russian mafia or something like that, totally accidentally. He was like on a language exchange trip or something. I think if you go on YouTube and search like The Machine or something, it'll come up. And he was telling the story about how, he got drunk, he was partying with the Russian mob or mafia. And he pauses the story, right? And he goes on a tangent about his wife and his family. He says one day he woke up with his wife and his kids, Sunday morning, peaceful morning, and everybody was just really happy. And he thought like, wow, my life is amazing. And he said that in that moment, he decided he will never cheat on his wife. And that if a very attractive young woman comes up to him, he's going to like say no and say, I'm married. And he made that decision in his mind to like never throw what he has right now, this perfection, never throw that away. This is his life's priority. This is what comes first, always. So he's never had a problem with his marriage because he made that decision one Sunday morning when everything was beautiful and he didn't take what he had for granted. Then he goes back to the train story, to robbing the train, and he says, I never had that internal conversation about robbing a train with the Russian mafia. So one thing led to another. He didn't speak the language. He was confused. They were pressuring him. And then all of a sudden he's, robbing this train. It's like, oh shit, how did I get myself in that situation? So I think that is a really good point for like co-founders too, because when you're calm and everything is happy and you realize what you have and you don't take it for granted, you can plan for scenarios that may happen in the future and you make your decision beforehand. And so If an attractive woman had approached him, he knew what to do, right? He didn't have to make split-second decisions. Not to say that he would be tempted or anything like that, but like in situations that you can control, when there's a lot of pressure, you kind of want to think through those scenarios and know how you're going to react. Because if you don't, you might end up robbing a train with the Russian mafia. And to give you an example, I have friends who are professional athletes, and they literally go through mental scenarios of, what do I do if the ball's here? What do I do if my teammate's there? What do I do if the other team does this? And they go through hundreds of these scenarios. The military does that too. The friends who I'd worked with who were in special operations, they sort of imagine the operation going down for weeks before they actually do it. What happens if somebody comes here? What happens if our equipment fails? And they go through these scenarios not to like be paranoid or to overthink them, right? That's very different from just having general anxiety, but because they know what to do after. If our equipment fails, this is how we deal with it. If, somebody comes from here, this is how we deal with it. If, whatever, then we do this. So having if this, then that statements are really important to nail down when you're, calm and cool and collected, so that when you're in a very high stress, high pressure situation, which starting a company definitely is, then you know how to deal with it. And so I think that's really important. From there, you can pick your top 3 like conversations to be had. Like for one of my friends, his co-founder is going off to business school. It's like, well, when that decision comes, how are we going to prioritize this? How are they going to balance school and the company? So have that conversation. Some people have kids on the way, or you are raising a round of funding. So how are you going to split the money or capital or whatever it is? It's kind of specific to the co-founders and the company, but having that framework of, if this terrible situation happens, then this is how we're going to deal with it.
Love the framework, because like you said, there are so many instances where we receive advice, but then the context doesn't align with it. And then if you don't have the ability to kind of work through that, that's kind of where you get stuck and you're like, well, that was garbage advice, but it's not actually garbage advice. It just didn't make sense for your situation potentially, right? So as we slowly wrap up our conversation, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I ask, what do you think it takes to unleash the potential of individuals and organizations?
That's a good one. It's like what is potential? I feel like everybody has this ideal image of what they want, right? Let's say in the context of co-founders, it's like being on the same page. And even when you do have conflict, is productive and being able to have fun together. I say that's a pretty good ideal. And then there's like where you're currently at. And your trajectory is sort of the benchmark by which you measure your happiness, not really even the distance, right? You could be really close, but if you're on a downward trajectory, it's not a great feeling. But you could be day one of your company and your ideal is to IPO together, but you're working towards that. That feels really good. And so I think for people to sort of unlock that potential to get here is 2 things. One, know the distance for sure, but know the direction. And being aware of it is the first step to actually doing something about it. And I guess we have time for one last example. I was a lifeguard when I was a teenager in Canada. And when you are, let's say you fall off a boat, right? You kind of disoriented, you weren't expecting to fall off. Let's say you're in a lake and it's nighttime, you can't really see. All you know is you're underwater, right? What matters most? How fast you're swimming or that you're swimming up, right? And a lot of times startups have this insane obsession with moving fast and iterating and executing quickly. And it's like, that's great. But if you're going the wrong direction, so you're going to your death more quickly. So first, blow some bubbles, figure it out which way is up. Same with your trajectory, with your co-foundership, like know where you're at and then see what you can do, like blow those metaphorical bubbles to see which way is up. Maybe that's having a conversation. Maybe that's having a coffee with your co-founder and just not talking about work. Maybe it's having your spouses meet, because that is also really important. And then once you figure out which way it's up, swim like hell, right? But I hope that's a good example for unlocking your potential.
100%. And I love the visual of that. And my last question to you is, what is one thing that is top of mind for you right now and potentially a way for the audience to stay connected with you?
Yeah, if the people want to stay connected, you can go to my website, cherrytree.app, get the newsletters, or reach out to me on LinkedIn and have a chat. I just love talking to co-founders or people who want to become co-founders as well. That's sort of top of mind, growing the newsletter as well as coaching and just having fun conversations with people. So Yeah.
And thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights with us. And to everyone else that's tuned into another episode, thank you for your time and attention. It means a lot to me, and I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode. Till then, stay safe.